Good morning, everyone. Pat, people always, or most always, start things with, "It is my pleasure." But it truly is my pleasure to introduce you this morning. We all know Pat Barth and her long ribbon of credentials. And I'll just give, when I asked Pat what she wanted me to say about her, she said, "I don't really like to be in the spotlight." So that's what she told me about herself. But I thought I'd say a little bit more. Pat is a clinical psychologist practicing, of course, here in Houston, Texas, a CGP Distinguished Fellow of AGPA. She has also served on the faculty at Baylor College and has supervised the group psychotherapy residency program. Anybody who's been around at AGPA knows Pat. She served AGPA as faculty for many years, leading workshops and serving as institute leader. I think one of Pat's most significant contributions is that she served as the group foundation chair for 8 years. That won't be me, Pat. And she provided tremendous leadership to us during the capital campaign. And during her tenure as chair, she was tireless in supporting the goals of the foundation and growing it into a thriving and dynamic organization that it is today. I'm pretty sure that I first met Pat in 1999 when AGPA was here last. And Pat and I were on a mentoring panel together with John Gladfelter and Judith Schulthouse-Reed, I believe, was our panel. It was my very first time to ever present at AGPA, and I was nerved up. I was young and extremely nervous. And I thought she was one of the most elegant, poised, and kindest people I had ever met as I was on that panel as a young professional. That raised my anxiety even more. And that wasn't about you, Pat. That was about me. You were wonderful to me. And I recall from her panel, she talked about her aunt, and I don't know much about what she said about her aunt, except she admired her a lot, she was a mentor to her, and that her aunt smoked cigarettes. Now, that was way back when. And that when Pat would go over, her aunt would roll her, I don't know, maybe, I don't really remember. This is just what I'm remembering from 1999. And that her aunt would roll her out a paper and let her pretend smoke. And I thought that was the coolest thing. And it reminded me of my Aunt Emma, who actually would do a similar thing with something she called rabbit grass. I don't know, I lived in the country. So it's been my pleasure to get to know Pat better through our work on the foundation. And Pat, we've come a long way, baby. As the Virginia Slims commercial always said, right? So as a token for you to remember this occasion, I brought you a pack of Virginia Slims. Please come up. Let's give Pat a round of applause.
Karen. You're welcome. And thanks to all of you for coming to Houston. I know you from the Northeast are really glad to be in Houston because you're having a terrible storm up there. So anyway, I apologize for the streets that are so torn up, but it's usually a very beautiful part of town, but you can't stop progress. So. And if it's your first time here, I hope that your stereotypes about Houston have been shattered. I was thinking about my early experiences coming down here. And I grew up in a small town in southern Indiana, right on the Kentucky border. And my favorite aunt that Karen I didn't know was going to talk about she was an Army nurse. And after the war, she came to Houston, and she was in charge of the polio unit at our general hospital here. She realized that some of the children that were there didn't really need to be in the hospital, but they still needed some medical care, and so she started something called the Wolf Home for Children. And that's where they could live together in a group atmosphere, eat at a big round table, and have more feeling of being at home. I would come down and spend many weeks in the summer with her, and I thought, well, maybe that's when I started thinking about this talk. Maybe that's where I got my first interest in caregiving and groups. So when my husband was finishing medical school, we went all over the country looking for internships, and I was thrilled when he picked Houston as his first choice. So we came down. We had just a few belongings, not many, and we needed a U-Haul trailer to pull what we had down here. So we go to the U-Haul store and told the guy what we needed, and he said, well, you know, I'm really sorry, but there are too many U-Haul trailers in Houston, and you're going to have to pay a really big surcharge. And so in my naivete, I said, well, gee, where else in Texas could we take the trailer? And he looked at his information. He said, well, you could take it to El Paso. So I said, well, honey, you just drop me off in Houston. We'll unload, and I'll unpack, and you just run the trailer back over to El Paso. So we signed the contract. We went out to the car, and I said, gee, maybe we should look at a map and see where El Paso is. It was further from Houston to El Paso than from Indianapolis to Houston. So obviously we made other plans. That was my first stereotype. Then, when my grandmother came down to visit, I picked her up at the airport, and we were driving to our house, and she said, oh, you have trees here. And I said, yes, we have trees, and you should see East Texas and the big piney woods. There are lots of trees. So last summer, you know, we traveled all over the world, and last summer we decided, well, let's take a driving trip and see parts of Texas that we hadn't seen. So we decided to drive from Houston to Durango, Colorado. We really got a feeling for how big this state really is and how different the areas are. One memorable sight was passing a ranch, and you know all of our ranches have names, but here is this ranch with a beautiful archway, wrought iron archway over the entrance, and we looked more closely, and it was called the Deep Shit Cattle Company. So there are lots of parts of Texas. So when I was asked to give this address, I was rather stunned because I'm more used to giving reports than speeches, and I thought, what in the world will I talk about? And, excuse me, it's very early on Friday morning when we're all pretty brain dead, and Marcia said, talk about the foundation. And I thought, been there, done that, and it's very early Friday morning, and we're all pretty brain dead. And then Elliot said, well, you can be entertaining, and I thought, well, that sounds like a better idea. It's really hard to follow all the great speakers we've had over the years. So I wanted this to be entertaining and meaningful. And I thought, well, I could talk about the development of my AGPA self. Now, I did not go back to Kohut because I didn't want to put everybody to sleep. But there definitely have been developmental stages. I think I've gone through using this organization as a vehicle. I'd really had very little organizational experience before going to Houston Group and AGPA. And when I was asked to go on the Houston Group board, I didn't know it was for a term, and then that the term could be renewed. I was never in a sorority. And I noticed while being in groups, while Butch was in medical school, that the women who had been in sororities seemed to know a lot about planning and organization. So I just watched and tried to learn. My first AGPA meeting was very lonely. I just assumed I'd go to dinner with my Houston friends, only to find out that they had other dinners and they had board meetings, and so I was left to my own devices. And I certainly learned that if I wanted to be a part of this group, I'd need to get involved in governance. Ann Alonzo had been my mentor and dissertation chair at Fielding, and one day she asked me if I'd like to join the foundation board, and I said, sure. And that's where I really began to get a feel for how organizations work. But then AGPA isn't just any organization, right? We've got these three parts, and we've got the conference co-chairs and the institute co-chairs and the overall meeting co-chairs. And it's very complicated, and it took a long time to figure that out. Well, everything began to fall into place until one day Isaiah Zimmerman called and asked if I would be chair of the foundation. Well, I almost fell out of the pedicure chair. I remember it clearly. And I said, well, thank you, but I just don't feel like I'm ready for that sort of responsibility to take on that position. But a few years later, I was asked again, and I accepted. Because I thought, well, if I really want to grow within myself, I need to take on some challenges. So my real journey began. I remember sitting in Marcia's office with Ann, and Ann saying, gee, we should start a capital campaign. So Marcia and I flew all over the country and meeting with small groups about talking about ways that we could accomplish paying off the mortgage, and that finally happened. At one of my very first board meetings, I have to say I was terrified. Around the table were about 5 past presidents of AGPA. A conflict ensued over something, I don't remember what, and I, feeling like I was 12 years old, lost all my group skills. Then I remember Bob Klein asking me to run for treasurer, and I said, me, the math-phobic person, can't I run for secretary? And he said no. So after 12 years on the AGPA board and 10 years on the exec, with 8 as foundation chair and 2 as treasurer, I decided that was enough responsibility. I've remained on the foundation board, but still hate to ask people for money. Even though everyone I've asked has been very nice and kind and generous, it's still hard for me to do. Dave Hawkins and Elliot Zeisel were great co-chairs, and of course Marcia, Diane, Angela, and the whole staff provided all the support and encouragement I needed. Now for the difficult part. I'm chronologically way past midlife, but just about there in terms of my participation in AGPA. I did my doctoral dissertation on the process of individuation in women at the midlife transition. And what I found was that women's individuation depended a lot on the relationships in their lives. A lot of my dreams are about either being at AGPA or being at meetings and groups. And that tells me how important this organization and all of you are to me. So when the divisiveness occurred last year at the meeting, it was really painful. So the theme of this year's meeting, the healing power of groups in a fragmented world, is certainly on target. I went to my first large group last year. Wow, what an eye-opener. I had heard it was primitive, but I truly wasn't prepared for the degree of hostility. Because we're all group people, I thought, and intellectually we understand splitting. But here it was happening before my very eyes, in a group therapy organization, mirroring what's going on in our world. Parallel processes, what Earl Hopper calls equivalence, and Yvonne Agazarian and Susan Gant call isomorphism. What's behind the scenes comes to light in the here and now at every system level. As group people, we have to be sensitive to this, to what's there, but not really being dealt with, for fear things will fall apart. So when I got home, I went back to one of my favorite books, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist who has spent 25 years of groundbreaking research on moral psychology. He shows how moral judgments arise not from reason, but from gut feelings. He uses the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. As mental health professionals, we know our mind is divided into parts that often conflict. To be human is to be pulled in different directions and to marvel, sometimes in horror, at our inability to control our actions. He calls the parts, the rider, our controlled processes, on an elephant, our automatic processes. The rider serves the elephant when we are morally dumbfounded. We have strong gut feelings about what's right and wrong, and we struggle to construct post hoc justifications for those feelings. Even if our reasoning doesn't make sense, our intuition does not change its judgment. There isn't time to go into detail about his research, but it felt like our elephants had taken over. It reaffirmed the power of the group. We're all small riders on a very large elephant. And I found that understanding that can make me more patient with other people. And that through respectful dialogue, we can each have our voice and our views. Spinoza said, no matter how thin you slice something, it still has two sides. We lost our beloved Cecil Rice this year. Cecil endured more trauma than hopefully any of us will ever know. And Scott Rattan described Cecil's views on groups, quote, "Give people the skills to help people talk openly and honestly to one another. And people learn from one another. And what they find over time, they start by thinking, oh, we're so different. How can this work? And over time, they realize, underneath it, we're all really the same. So our journey as a group goes on, as does my journey as part of this group. There will be ups and downs, but hopefully we can continue to work together and get through them to try and understand and respect each other, to allow for political and ideological differences, to allow for the unconscious breakthroughs we all have, to understand unconscious scapegoating. So I thought of how I wanted to end this address. One idea was that since the cover of our brochure has a bunch of cowboy boots on it and the rodeo is in town, that I'd asked David, and I never told him this, to come up and we could do a Roy Rogers, Dale Evans rendition of Happy Trails to You. My analyst didn't think that was such a good idea. And I said, look, group is not the American Psychoanalytic Association. But what I really want to do is to do a presentation. So I'd like to ask Les Green to come up. I probably should say trash talking Les Green. You know, we had a World Series a few months ago. After the Yankees beat the Astros in Game 3, I believe, of the ALCS, Les posted on the listserv a really snarky message. To my dear friends and colleagues in Houston, in case you missed the last couple of innings of last night's Yankees-Astros American League Championship Series, my New York Yankees most impressively came from behind to win. As President Trump might tweet, sad Houston, very sad. Okay, so somebody, I think from Boston, wrote back and said the words that were the first two words my grandsons, born in Boston and avid Red Sox fans, taught their little sister to say when she started to talk was Yankees suck. And I followed with, and this may not be really Yogi Berra, but I thought it was. As Yogi Berra said, Les, it's not over till the fat lady sings, so be nice. Don't leave yet. So, as you know, the Astros, after beating the Red Sox, went on to beat the Yankees and then beat the Dodgers to win the World Series, bigly. So I have a gift for you, Les. Jose Altuve. So now Houston fans can join Boston fans in saying Yankees suck. Yeah, the Astros came from behind as underdogs, and teams or groups and good teamwork can be one of the first casualties of scapegoating as a way of maintaining the illusion of cohesion. This is true for our groups, organizations, and societies. Working together requires open discussion and disagreement if the group team is not going to disintegrate under pressure and the challenges brought by social change. This is a challenge for us all, and I think we can rise to that challenge. So I'll start by saying the Yankees don't really suck. Thank you.